To listen to the stark warnings of the parallels between the 1930s and now.
I'm sure you're familiar with the words of Admiral Rob Bauer. So he's warning. We've had quite a few warnings recently, actually. It's quite sobering. So, this particular warning, as you will know, Western countries need to prepare themselves for all out war with Russia in the next 20 years and a return to conscription. Do you think this is exaggerated or not?
Well, he's putting matters quite starkly, and in a sense, I can understand why he's doing that. It is much better for us to be prepared. It's much better for us to take a strong deterrent position, because the last thing we want to do is to fight another bloody war such as we did twice in the last century. And the reason, I think we all agree, with a backward glance to history, is the reason particularly we got involved in the Second World War, is that there was a failure to rearm in the 1930s when there was the threat of a dictator threatening the security of Europe. The net result of that was that appeasement failed, talks failed, and we were unprepared for war, and then had to go through a very expensive 6-year world war. So to listen to the stark warnings of the parallels between the 1930s and now makes a lot of sense.
Preparation and rearming costs money, obviously, and there's always this tension, isn't there? Russia has tripled its military expenditure to 40% of the entire national budget. Now, obviously, they're engaged in a war, so we're not comparing like with like. But I mean, could other countries match that? That would mean taking money from somewhere else, and spending more money on something.
Of course it would. And Russia is having to spend that proportion of its GDP because it is fighting a war. What we want to ensure is that we do not have to fight a war. Again, parallels back to the 1930s. In 1935, this country was spending less than 3% of GDP on defense. By 1939, when the war had begun, it went up to 18%. And in 1940, when we were fighting for our lives, it was 46%. So my point is, if you get involved in fighting a war, it's horrific for your economy. But here's the question. Should we not be spending, say, 3 or 4% of our GDP today on making sure that we have a strong capability to deter future aggression? That in the medium to long term is a much better use of resources.
I suppose there are some people again who are perhaps not as experienced as you in the field who perhaps think, well, hang on a second, we the Second World War and the First World War were a long time ago. We haven't seen anything on that scale. We have had people talking about in terms of World War III since, well, definitely since Ukraine and Russia, perhaps before that. But we do live in different times, and yes, there are very many dangerous aggressors around the world currently that we're very much aware of. But how helpful is it, really, realistically, to talk about today in the context of the First and Second World Wars?
Well, I think it is useful to have a backward glance to see what we did and didn't do, and to ask ourselves the question whether we're doomed not to learn the lessons of history. But I think the parallel today is instructive insofar as, whereas in the 1930s there was a dictator who was a threat, today we have a dictator who is not just a threat, he's a proven aggressor. And the focus of his aggression is NATO and the West. Remember that Putin, scraping to the core, is an unreformed KGB colonel whose beloved Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union was destroyed at the end of the Cold War by the unity of NATO and the West. He would love to write that down. And that's why he's pressing in Ukraine, he's threatening elsewhere. And if we do not show that we are determined to deter further aggression, he might be tempted to give it a go. Push through Belarus to Kaliningrad through Lithuania. Lithuania is a NATO member. Article 5, an attack on one member is an attack on all. We could find ourselves, whether we like it or not, getting involved in war. So deterrence, which comes at a cost, is really important, and that cost is much less than fighting a war.
What about the return of conscription?
Well, this is an interesting one, and it was a slightly surprising comment, but understandable in the context of a Dutch officer speaking. Most European countries have had conscription and national service as a matter of course until relatively recently. We have not done so. We had conscription in the First World War and the Second World War. We introduced it briefly between 1949 and 1963 because the pressures of policing empire were so great, but it's not a traditional activity of the United Kingdom. But for European countries, it is. But the underlying point, or the underlying question, is if there is going to be pressure on our armed forces, do we have sufficient manpower in our Navy, Army, and Air Force to man the equipment that we need to be able to deter aggression, or indeed, heaven forbid, to actually fight a war?
Now, you've written in the Times today about the recruitment crisis in the military, and you've described the army as stretching itself to breaking point. Um, this has been said before. It doesn't make it any less important. Why do you think that this might land this time?
Well, I think one has to briefly ask why the army is struggling to recruit. And there are two principal reasons. One is that when the economy is buoyant and unemployment is low, it makes it more difficult for the armed forces to recruit. Therefore, the offer, if you like, in terms of pay to attract recruits and also pay to retain trained manpower is important. So that's an aspect of it. And the other one is a quirky one, really. Um, when we have a small war being fought somewhere, recruiting is so much easier because there's always a proportion of our younger population that want to test themselves, to pitch themselves in a conflict. And that's not happening at the present moment. The irony is, when I was the army chief 10, 12 years ago, we had an army of 102,000 and were running extremely hot. But we were fighting two campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, the army is at about 74,000 and going down, not actually involved in a fight in a shooting war, but extraordinarily busy in its training commitments all around the world, and also some of its deterrent deployments in Estonia and Poland and other places on the NATO front line.
Mm.
And come back to my point about the importance of deterrence. That is really important in order to prevent war, for all the cost reasons and the human treasure and blood reasons.
You're calling on the government or the next government to commit to 3% of GDP to be spent on defence now. And I go back to the question, I suppose, again, where does a 3% figure come from and how realistic do you think it is when you look at the demands of the public sector?
Well, that, of course, is the challenge for this government, and after the general election, whoever forms the government then. And a huge challenge for governments is to weigh up priorities. Yes, of course, there are huge priorities in terms of our education and our health budget and our social affairs budget. But the first duty of any government is to protect the sovereignty of our land, of our integrity of our boundaries, and the security of our people. So this has to be a very fine judgment as to what proportion of our overall expenditure goes on defence. Now, 3% of GDP would be somewhere over £50 billion. We're currently spending 180 to 190 billion pounds on our health service. Now, well, judgments have to be made. Of course, the other point is, and this is something many politicians are saying, if we can get growth going in our economy, then the size of the pie gets bigger, and 2.5% or 3% of GDP in cash terms becomes greater, and therefore we can spend more on defence. But if we got only sluggish growth or no growth, or heaven forbid a recession, then the problem gets even greater.